Live from southern Israel, this is BBC News. The Israeli military says it's striking Hamas targets in all parts of Gaza as the UN Security Council hears that the situation is becoming increasingly desperate. The US says it hopes around 100 trucks of aid will soon enter Gaza each day following discussions with Israel.
What we have got so far is 150 trucks in the last 10 days, and what we need, according to the UN, is 100 trucks, a minimum of 100 trucks every day.
The United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees has urged members of the UN Security Council to push for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
I'm Maryam Moshiri in London. Also in the programme, King Charles and Queen Camilla are starting their 4-day state visit in Kenya, where he will acknowledge painful aspects of its colonial past. Armed Japanese police have surrounded a post office in Saitama Prefecture following a shooting involving one gunman.
Hello, this is BBC News Now, 3 hours of fast-moving news, interviews and reaction. And I'm Anna Foster, live here in southern Israel, overlooking the Gaza border as the Israeli military continues the intensification of its bombardment of the Gaza Strip. We've heard from the IDF this morning that in the last 24 hours or so, more than 300 Hamas targets, they say, inside Gaza have been hit. These new pictures have been released by the IDF this morning, showing their ground operations inside Gaza. They say that they have encountered anti-tank missiles and machine gun fire as they advance into Gaza, much of which we have heard here from our position on the border in southern Israel. An Israel Defense Force spokesperson said that they were hunting commanders of Hamas and attacking infrastructure. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has said that Gaza is in an imminent public health catastrophe. It says that the mass displacement of people has led to overcrowding and that there's a serious lack of things like sanitation and damage to water infrastructure as well. The United States has said in the last few hours that it is optimistic that the number of aid trucks entering Gaza will soon increase to 100 a day. But it is something that we have heard said more than once in the last few weeks, and the number of trucks still remains far, far less than what would be seen at normal times, and certainly far less than the level of need which is being experienced in Gaza just now. You can see these live pictures from southern Israel looking into Gaza, still smoke rising from some of the buildings here. And we have heard just in the last hour or so some really loud airstrikes. The pictures that you can see there in that area, we saw the earth being thrown up into the sky. We heard really loud sounds of bombs being dropped by planes. And you can really sort of see the destruction in those pictures there. You can see the destruction and the damage there in Gaza that has been left by more than 3 weeks now of war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Well, let's get the very latest on this fast developing story with our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Nell, who is in Jerusalem. Just a small insight there into the incredibly difficult situation that more than 2 million civilians are facing in Gaza just now. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're live with BBC News. We are here in southern Israel, overlooking Gaza after more than 3 weeks now of war by Israel on Hamas in Gaza after those devastating attacks on October the 7th, in which more than 1,400 Israelis were killed in these southern border communities. And what we also now see is a growing humanitarian crisis inside Gaza, where more than 1 million people have been forced to move from the north of the Strip, which has been described as a battlefield as this ongoing military operation gathers pace. And they've had to move into the south of Gaza. Many people displaced, many of them without food and water, and medical care is in very short supply at the moment as well. And I spoke a little earlier to Salvi Ross from the humanitarian movement Doctors of the World in the occupied Palestinian territories. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Heck from the IDF, and you could see there as he was speaking the pictures of that huge plume of smoke rising above the skyline in Gaza, one of the biggest we've seen in the last few days from an airstrike. Stay with us on BBC News.
This is BBC News, the latest headlines. The Israeli military says it's targeting Hamas in all parts of Gaza. It reports large exchanges with Hamas overnight as the ground offensive continues. The US says it hopes around 100 trucks of aid will soon enter Gaza each day following discussions with Israel.
What we have got so far is 150 trucks in the last 10 days, and what we need, according to the UN, is 100 trucks, a minimum of 100 trucks every day.
The United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees has urged members of the UN Security Council to push for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. King Charles and Queen Camilla are starting their 4-day state visit in Kenya, where he will acknowledge painful aspects of its colonial past. Armed Japanese police have surrounded a post office in Saitama Prefecture following a shooting involving one gunman. Well, let's carry on with our top story now. UN aid agencies have pleaded again for an immediate ceasefire and access to Gaza, warning of catastrophic shortages of clean water, food, fuel and medicines. The UN children's organisation UNICEF said it feared generational trauma to children enduring the bombardment and siege. Well, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, more than 8,300 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. That's 8,300 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since the conflict began on the 7th of October. Well, those killed included 3,400 children after 3 weeks of intense bombing. More than 420 children are being killed or injured in Gaza every day as Israel pressed on with its air and ground campaign against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Well, let's talk now to Toby Fricker, who's the spokesman for UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and those are very, very sobering figures indeed. Just tell me what you're hearing about the situation right now. I'm going to stop you there because you are on the BBC. We're giving you a platform to speak.
I understand, but I
think that's important to underline the fact that we've given both you and your brother a platform to speak today, and I hope you appreciate that. Basma, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're live with me, Maryam Moshiri, on BBC News. Armed Japanese police have surrounded a post office in Saitama Prefecture near Tokyo, where a gunman is holding one person hostage. One other person who'd been held captive, thought to be a post office employee, has now been released. Well, the gunman is alleged to have opened fire at a nearby hospital before fleeing the scene on a motorbike. Well, let's take you live now to Tokyo and speak with our correspondent there, Shaima Khalil. Shaima, what's the latest? OK, Anne, thank you very much indeed. Anne Soy there, keeping across the King and Queen's visit in Kenya and all the different aspects of that. Well, let's just take you live now and show you the scene in Gaza, because, of course, we're keeping across what's happening there. It's our top story today. And the very latest we're hearing is that Israel has said in the last hour or so that there were large exchanges with Hamas in Gaza overnight as its ground offensive continues. We've seen, as my colleague Anna said earlier, in Gaza, she's just outside Gaza in southern Israel, that she heard a number of explosions and artillery fire within the Gaza region. We know that the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, has intensified its attacks on Gaza. Airstrikes on the Gaza Strip have continued overnight and indeed today. In fact, Israel told the media that around 300 targets were hit in total. We also know that the Hamas health authorities have told us that 8,500 people have been killed since Israel's retaliatory bombing began. And also on top of that, we know that more than 230 hostages from Israel are being held by Hamas in Gaza. We'll have more on all of those aspects of this story at the top of the hour here on BBC News. Live from London, this is BBC News. The Israeli military says it's targeting Hamas in all parts of Gaza. It reports large exchanges with Hamas. The US says it hopes around 100 trucks of aid will soon enter Gaza each day following discussions with Israel.
What we have got so far is 150 trucks in the last 10 days, and what we need, according to the UN, is 100 trucks, a minimum of 100 trucks every day.
In other news, armed Japanese police have surrounded a post office where a gunman is holding a hostage. And King Charles and Queen Camilla are starting their 4-day state visit in Kenya, where he'll acknowledge painful aspects of its colonial past. Hello and a warm welcome to BBC News Now. I'm Maryam Moshiri. Our main story this hour: Israel says its forces are striking Hamas targets in all parts of Gaza, as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon. In the last few minutes, the Israel Defense Force has said it's engaged in what it calls fierce battles with Hamas. We'll take a look at these. These are pictures from the Defense Forces showing their ground operations. The IDF says it's encountered anti-tank missiles and machine gun fire as they advance into Gaza. An Israel Defense Forces spokesperson said it was hunting commanders of Hamas and attacking infrastructure. Well, meanwhile, the World Health Organization says Gaza is an imminent public health catastrophe. It says the mass displacement of people has led to overcrowding and that there is a lack of sanitation. The United States says it's optimistic the number of aid trucks entering Gaza will soon increase to around 100 a day. We'll take a look at this. This is the live shot from southern Israel. Looking at Gaza, you can still see some smoke rising in the distance. There have been continued bombardments of Gaza through the night and through the day. The IDF saying they targeted 300 Hamas targets overnight alone. Well, thousands of buildings have been destroyed and people have little access to water, food, fuel and other essentials. Well, now, with the very latest, we can cross live to southern Israel and to our correspondent Anna Foster. And Anna, just bring us up to date with what we know about the Israeli air and ground offensive so far.
Well, those things that you were describing just there, Maryam, we can see and hear regularly. You hear the airstrikes all through the night and you see and hear during the day. I mean, in fact, just in the last hour, we saw a huge airstrike, one of the biggest plumes of smoke I've seen, black and grey clouds rising into the sky on the skyline behind me, because this is northern Gaza in the background, and this is where much of that intensified Israeli military operation is going on just now. And as you were describing there, we know that there are infantry troops on the ground. We have seen these images of Israeli tanks at work, armoured vehicles, bulldozers. They say that they are really digging into Gaza City, which is believed to be Hamas's operational stronghold, behind the scenes and openly as well, to try and stop that from happening.
Anna, as always, thank you very much indeed for your reporting from Israel. Anna Foster there, my colleague and correspondent there in southern Israel. Thanks again. Well, Israel has announced the first rescue of a hostage, a soldier who was kidnapped by Hamas on the 7th of October. She is Private Ori Megiddish, and she is said to be doing well and has reunited with her family. No details, though, have been given of the exact circumstances of her rescue. But as one hostage is rescued, more than 230 are still believed to be trapped in Gaza. On Monday, we heard from 3 of them. This is a still from the video released by Hamas. From the left to right, you see Rimon Kisht, Danielle Aloni and Lena Trupanov. We don't know anything about the conditions under which it was filmed, but 3 women appear to be in reasonable health with no obvious signs of injury. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the video was cruel psychological propaganda. Well, as we heard there from Anna and earlier from our correspondent there, Rushdie, the situation in Gaza is extremely grim. The World Health Organization says Gaza is in an imminent public health catastrophe. Well, let's get more now on the situation on the ground in Gaza. We've been speaking to our correspondent, Rushdie Abu-Alouf. OK.
But they don't have electricity and they don't have power.
I'm so sorry, Julie. We have run out of time, but it's been really important to get Christian Aid onto the show. I appreciate your time. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're watching BBC News. You're live with me, Maryam Moshiri. It's hardly the most important consideration, but the Israel-Gaza conflict has taken a severe toll on journalists covering the conflict. Since October the 7th alone, at least 31 journalists have been killed, while 8 others have been injured. And as of Tuesday, 9 journalists are either reported missing or held in detention, according to the International Federation of Journalists. Well, let's now speak to Tim Dawson, Deputy Secretary-General for the International Federation of Journalists, and just give me an understanding, Tim, of how difficult this story has been for journalists to cover. Tim, thank you very much indeed for that. Tim Dawson, Director-General, Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. Before we go, let's just take you very briefly to Gaza. I don't know if we can show you the live picture. OK, this is the live page of the BBC's website. This is the very latest updated live page on the BBC's website. You can go to it either from the website or from the BBC's News app. This will show you all the very latest lines, pictures and video updated continuously by our correspondents across the Middle East. And if we take you to the live picture of what's happening in Gaza, blue skies, but the clouds continue to hang over Gaza and Gaza City. We've seen a number of explosions already in the last few hours alone, and the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, confirming they have intensified their attack both on the ground and in the air. More in a few minutes' time on BBC News. This is BBC News, the latest headlines. The Israeli military says it's targeting Hamas in all parts of Gaza. It reports large exchanges with Hamas overnight as the ground offensive continues. Meanwhile, the US says it hopes around 100 aid trucks will soon enter Gaza every day following discussions with Israel. The UN Relief Agency for Palestinians urges members of the Security Council to push for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. King Charles and Queen Camilla are starting their 4-day state visit in Kenya, where he'll acknowledge painful aspects of its colonial past. Armed Japanese police have surrounded a post office in Saitama Prefecture following a shooting. And let's continue with our top story. UN aid agencies have again pleaded for an immediate ceasefire and access to Gaza, warning of catastrophic shortages of clean water, food, fuel and medicines. The UN Children's Organisation UNICEF said it feared generational trauma for children enduring the bombardment and siege. Well, the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says more than 8,300 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since the conflict began on the 7th of October. That's more than 3 weeks of intense bombing. The ministry officials say that toll includes around 3,400 children. UNICEF says more than 420 children are being killed or injured in Gaza every day as Israel presses on with its air and ground campaign against Hamas, which is prescribed as a terrorist organisation by some countries. Well, UNICEF spokesman Toby Fricker told me more about the crisis facing children in Gaza. Shama Khalil, our correspondent in Tokyo there. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. You're watching BBC News with me, Maryam Moshiri. Well, in a month, the world's biggest climate conference will begin in the United Arab Emirates. But there are already signs deep divisions could hamper progress. After more than 30 years of these talks, greenhouse gas emissions are still rising. And the talks are being held against the background, of war in Europe and in the Middle East. Well, our climate editor, Justin Rolat, is in Abu Dhabi. More in a few minutes' time at the top of the hour. Stay with us on BBC News. Live from London, this is BBC News. The Israeli military says it's targeting Hamas in all parts of Gaza. It reports large exchanges with its fighters. The US says it hopes around 100 aid trucks will soon enter Gaza each day following discussions with Israel.
What we have got so far is 150 trucks in the last 10 days, and what we need, according to the UN, is 100 truck, a minimum of 100 truck every day.
The UN Relief Agency for Palestinians urges members of the UN Security Council to push for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. In other news, reports a gunman who was holding a hostage in Japan has now been detained. And King Charles and Queen Camilla start their 4-day state visit in Kenya, where he will acknowledge painful aspects of its colonial past. Hello, I'm Maryam Moshiri. A very warm welcome to BBC News Now. Our main story this hour: Israel says forces are striking Hamas targets in all parts of Gaza, as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Israel Defense Forces has reported engaging in what it described as fierce battles with Hamas. Well, these are IDF pictures showing the Israeli ground operations. It says it's encountered anti-tank missiles and machine gun fire as it advances into Gaza. An IDF spokesperson says it was attacking infrastructure and hunting commanders of Hamas, which the UK, US and other governments recognise as a terror organisation. There's Michael Caponi there. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Well, let's take a... You're live with me, Maryam Moshiri. I want to take you to Washington now, where the US Secretary of State has been giving evidence to a Senate committee. The hearing was interrupted pretty quickly by these protests. Have a look at this.
Committee will suspend. And again, I appreciate that people feel passionately about these issues. I would ask that you respect our witnesses and our committee members and allow the American people to hear their testimony. We will pause until the room is cleared.
Well, Anthony Blinken is trying to persuade senators it's in the country's best interest to provide billions more dollars to Ukraine and Israel, despite huge budget deficits. Well, this is what Anthony Blinken had to say after that protest. That's very, very difficult to watch, isn't it? Well, let's take you to Gaza now. And this is the live picture coming into us. And you can just about see the black smoke that we've seen thick on the horizon dissipating very slowly as the day wears on in Gaza. We know that the intensification of the bombardment has been confirmed by the Israel Defense Forces, and also we've been getting a few lines coming into us from the IDF, and they have only given a few brief comments, the Israeli military, but they say that they are expanding ground operations. We're hearing from inside Gaza that tanks and armoured vehicles are moving steadily towards Gaza City, where the IDF says Hamas has a network of tunnels used as a command and control centre. So more, of course, as always, coming up on that story. And there is another view of Gaza, this time from southern Israel towards Gaza. Stay with us here on BBC News. A full roundup of all the latest business is coming up with my colleague Ben Thompson. Stay with us on the BBC.
Now on BBC News, the latest business news from across the globe. World Business Report.
BP unveils more than $3 billion in profit for the third quarter, but it is way lower than expected. And all three big US automakers have now agreed deals with the union. So are the threats of strikes finally over? Hello, welcome along. This is World Business Report. I'm Ben Thompson. We'll come on to that latest development in that long-running dispute in the United States with auto workers. But we're going to start with this company, with BP, because the oil giant has just announced it made a $3.3 billion profit in the third quarter. The figure, though, is way below the $8 billion profit that BP made during the same quarter last year when energy prices spiked after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. BP also said it was extending its $1.5 billion share repurchase programme. So let's get the assessment of what these numbers tell us. Nick Butler is a former BP executive, now visiting professor at King's College London. Good to have you on the programme. So these figures, the numbers themselves look pretty good, but given the context and given the background in which they come, they have disappointed, haven't they? Just explain why. Jada Silva with the latest there from our Asia Business Hub. Some other business stories for you. The annual rate of inflation in the Eurozone dropped more than expected in October. Consumer price inflation slowed to 2.9%. That is the lowest rate since July of 2021. Overall economic growth fell in the third quarter of 2023 and is weighed down by its largest economy, Germany. I promised you two stories, you got one. More on the website, bbc.com/business. We'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.
You're watching BBC News. I'm Maryam Moshiri. Let's return you now to the conflict in the Middle East. UN aid agencies have again pleaded for an immediate ceasefire and access to Gaza, warning of catastrophic shortages of clean water, food, fuel and other medicines. Well, the UN children's organisation UNICEF said it feared generational trauma for children enduring the bombardment and siege. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says more than 8,300 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since the conflict began on the 7th of October. That's more than 3 weeks of intense bombing, and the ministry officials say that toll includes around 3,400 children. And it says more than 420 children are being killed or injured in Gaza every day as Israel presses on with its air and ground campaign against Hamas, which is recognised as a terrorist organisation by the UK, the US and some other Western nations. Well, UNICEF spokesperson Toby Fricker told me more about the crisis facing children in Gaza. Before we go, a quick reminder of our top story, and that is that dozens of deaths have been reported in a Gaza refugee camp blast we've been reporting on our live page. Let's take you there very briefly. This is what you can see from, I think, the camera in southern Israel. A Reuters photographer has taken pictures, you can see them on our live page, of the Jabalia refugee camp. Other pictures from the camp in northern Gaza show people searching for survivors and pulling bodies from the rubble. Deaths have been reported at that refugee camp in the last hour or so. That's breaking news coming into us here on the BBC. I'm sure we'll have more on that story in the next few minutes. My colleague Matthew is here at the top of the hour, so do stay with us as always on BBC News. Bye-bye from me.